The UFC made $1.4 billion in 2024, and the fighters who bled, trained, and risked their health to generate every single dollar of that revenue received less than 15% of it. Let that number sink in. A $12 billion company, and the people whose bodies it sells kept less than 15 cents of every dollar. This is not a rumor. This is not an opinion. These are the numbers that came out in a federal court of law. And by the time this video is over, you are going to understand exactly why the biggest stars in combat sports are walking away, and why the UFC's grip on MMA is finally, for the first time ever, starting to break. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers tell the whole story. In the NBA, NFL, and NHL, athletes receive roughly 50% of total league revenue. That is the result of decades of collective bargaining, player unions, and organized negotiation. In the UFC, fighters receive somewhere between 13 and 18%. That gap is not an accident. That gap is a business decision made by people who understood that fighters, without a union, without collective bargaining rights, and without the ability to freely move between promotions, had no real leverage at the negotiating table. Entry-level UFC fighters start on $12,000 to show and $12,000 to win. That means if you lose, you made $12,000 before taxes, before paying your coach 10%, before paying your manager another 15%, before covering your own flights, your own medical bills, and your own training camp costs. In 2025, UFC fighter Chase Hooper publicly broke down the math for every fan who was paying attention. He said that after coaches take 10%, management takes 15%, and the government takes 35% in taxes, a fighter is left with approximately 40% of whatever number was announced at the press conference. 40%. And that is before any other expense. Former fighter Miles Jury revealed publicly that after all deductions from a $20,000 purse, he netted just $5,500 in profit. $5,500 to fight inside an octagon in front of a sold-out crowd on a broadcast that generated millions of dollars in pay-per-view revenue. And there is something even more important that most fans do not understand: the contract structure itself. UFC contracts include what is known as a Champions Clause. This clause means that if a fighter wins a title, their contract is automatically extended. The UFC decides by how much. The fighter has no say. In addition, every UFC contract includes an exclusive negotiating window, meaning even after a contract expires, the UFC has the right to match any offer a fighter receives from another promotion. And until recently, there was also a right of first refusal clause that gave the UFC a full year after a contract ended to retain a fighter. This is not a sports contract. This is a structure specifically designed to ensure that no fighter, no matter how talented or famous, has any real freedom to leave. A federal judge in Nevada reviewed this system and agreed. In 2023, Judge Richard Boulware ruled that the plaintiffs in the UFC antitrust lawsuit had established that the UFC engaged in willful anti-competitive conduct and maintained its market power through exclusionary practices. Those are not the words of a YouTube commentator. Those are the words of a United States federal judge. The lawsuit itself is one of the most important stories in the history of combat sports. It was first filed in 2014 by former fighters Kung Lei, John Fitch, and Kyle Kingsbury. Over 1,100 fighters joined the class action, arguing that the UFC used its monopoly over the MMA market, which it controlled at roughly 90%, to artificially suppress fighter pay. The case went on for a decade. The UFC spent enormous resources fighting it, and in February 2025, U.S. District Judge Richard Boulware granted final approval to a $375 million settlement paid to over 1,100 fighters. Anderson Silva, the greatest middleweight champion in UFC history, received the highest individual payout of $10.3 million. The average payout was $231,000. But here is the critical detail. The settlement included no structural reforms to UFC contracts, no elimination of the Champions Clause, no change to the exclusive negotiating window, no requirement to increase fighter pay. The UFC paid $375 million and changed almost nothing. And remember, the initial damages sought were $1.6 billion. The UFC settled for less than a quarter of that number and admitted no wrongdoing. Former fighter Nate Query, one of the original plaintiffs, described the culture inside the UFC to the court this way: "They just get blacklisted, they get cut, they get put on the undercard, they are given opponents that aren't going to be a good matchup for them. The UFC is very vindictive. You're either with the company or you're against it. And then came Francis Ngannou, and everything changed. Ngannou was the UFC heavyweight champion, the most feared man in combat sports, a man who knocked out every elite opponent placed in front of him with power that had never been seen before in the heavyweight division. And in January 2023, he walked away from the UFC while still holding the belt, the first active champion to do so in nearly 20 years. He walked away from an $8 million fight with Jon Jones. He walked away from the biggest payday of his career, and he said publicly, in plain English, exactly why. Speaking to Ariel Helwani on the MMA Hour, Ngannou said, "In that contract, I'm not free. In that contract, I'm not an independent contractor. In that contract, I have no rights, I have no power. I hand over all the power to you guys, and I've seen in the past how you can utilize that power." Before his final UFC fight, Ngannou had revealed he had already left $7 million on the table in previous contract negotiations, just to try to get a better deal. The UFC never moved, so he left. And when he signed with the PFL, he negotiated the right to also box professionally, something the UFC had refused to allow. He knocked down Tyson Fury in a boxing match. He went the distance with one of the greatest heavyweight boxers alive. He proved that a fighter outside the UFC could still compete at the absolute highest level of combat sports. And that fact alone sent a message to every fighter still trapped inside a UFC contract. Because Ngannou was not the last. After the PFL acquired Bellator MMA in late 2023, the combined rosters suddenly had 30% of the world's top 25 ranked fighters, the same percentage as the UFC itself. For the first time in MMA history, there was a legitimate second option. Fighters who had always been told there was nowhere else to go suddenly had somewhere else to go. Shane Burgos left the UFC for the PFL and said publicly that the PFL offered him more money in one fight than the UFC had paid him across multiple fights combined. He called the financial decision a no-brainer. And Dana White's response to all of this has remained consistent throughout the years. In a 2022 interview with GQ Sports, White said, "Fighters always want to make more money. That's never going to happen while I'm here. Believe me, these guys get paid what they're supposed to get paid. They eat what they kill." They eat what they kill. That is the actual philosophy of the most powerful combat sports executive on the planet, running a $12 billion organization, paying its athletes less than 15% of what they generate. Now let's be honest about what the UFC does provide. The UFC is, without question, the biggest stage in MMA. Fighting in the UFC means global exposure, pay-per-view audiences, ESPN broadcasts, and the kind of visibility that can generate sponsorship deals and business opportunities that smaller promotions simply cannot offer. The top earners in the UFC do make serious money. Jon Jones made $6.29 million in 2024. Alex Pereira was the most active and highest-paid top-tier fighter of that year. Israel Adesanya earned $3.5 million for a single fight. The infrastructure of the UFC, the production, the marketing, the global reach, is genuinely unmatched. But here is the problem with that argument. Those numbers apply to the top 1% of the roster. While Jones made $6 million, fighters on the same card were making $12,000 to show. The gap between the top and the bottom of the UFC roster is so extreme that it effectively makes the success stories irrelevant to the experience of the average UFC fighter. And the average UFC fighter, according to research published in 2024, earns less than $45,000 per year for a profession that permanently damages their body, shortens their career, and offers no health insurance, no pension, and no union representation. This is the moment where MMA stands right now. The UFC's broadcast deal with ESPN expired in 2025 and moved to a new arrangement involving Paramount and other partners. The PFL, with its acquisition of Bellator, has positioned itself as a genuine rival for the first time. New promotions like Netflix-backed MMA events are entering the space. Fighters are beginning to understand that the leverage they were told they never had is actually within reach, if enough of them organize together. Ngannou did not just leave the UFC, he opened a door, and every fighter who walks through that door after him makes it harder for the UFC to close it again. The sport of MMA is at a turning point. The athletes who built it deserve to be paid like it.